Good morning again, everybody. We'll go through some very brief introductions, and then we'll show how Vectra can detect adversaries in your network and how they can automate these things, how they can make these things bubble up with the machine learning engines. So my name is Luc Schoonaert. I'm Director of Technology with Exclusive Networks. I'm not going to be speaking much today except for the introduction. I will also deal with the questions. So if anybody has a question, please enter the question in the questions box, and then we'll deal with those at the end. So I'll get Davey to introduce himself next.
Hello, good morning. So my name is Davey de Mits. I'm a technical pre-sales consultant at Exclusive Networks. I've been in IT and cybersecurity for 10 years with a background in firewall network security. And also some machine learning. I'll be also a silent attendee for today and let most of the time Stan talk.
Good morning. My name is Stan Rowens, and within Vectra, I'm running the security engineering system team within Northern Europe and Southern Europe. My backgrounds are going back already 20 years, and primarily I've been working in network security. So I've had my tenures at Juniper Networks, Palo Alto Networks, and then most recently I was working for Symantec, where I was heading the cybersecurity cloud component. So we had the CASB plus other solutions under us. And then since the beginning of the mid of May, I joined the Vectra team here out of Belgium. What we do is network and detection and response, but I would say it's more likely that we will talk about threat detection, but NDR is now a new name also by Gartner. As said by Luc, please make sure that if you have questions to put them into the questions box, and we will make sure to take care of those by the end of the session. Let's kick it off and review quickly what the agenda is. So we would like to maybe do a quick introduction in what are security challenges, what are attacks, and how are adversaries working in a network today. How do we look at that as coming from Vectra? What is our unique capability, you could say? And then I would like to have some time for a demo before we make some conclusions to finish the webinar. When we kick it off, and I'll promise you there will be not too many marketing slides, but this one actually, although it's not really marketing, is still, I think, a very important one to take a little bit of time on. If you get attacked today, it will cost you, right? It will cost you. It will cost you on not just the impact of the attack, but probably there's also going to be the cleanup, what is going to be the incident response, and potentially also with the GDPR these days, there could be also a fine coming along. There has been multiple examples, even in Belgium, in the last few quarters and even years. But for instance, if you look at what the ransomware attack at Maersk cost them, that was big time. So there is a need for us to come in between, you could say, that initial infection and the time to detect very quickly, so to contain the damage as much as possible. And that is exactly where you need not only to look at prevention capabilities, but also at detection, because if prevention would have been able to catch it, there would have not been any damage, of course. This is not to kind of scare you away, and I'm not going, of course, to go into all of these fields, but when we talk about persistency, that means we talk about an attack that is taking time to get into your network. We typically talk about 100 days, right? That an attacker is in your network before either the damage or the exfiltration of data is done. And they need to find somewhere an entry point. And typically, of course, this is still with phishing emails where people are trying to get into the network by tricking people to click on a link, and therefore there's an infection on the system. But that's step one. What we also see today more and more is that the attack vectors are shifting into the cloud. And with Office 365, we've had just recently, again, a few cases where companies were impacted because an attacker could take actually control of the mailbox of a few of the people inside by installing a little app. And the app is asking permissions to be able to talk to Office 365. And the bad thing about that is, even if you have multi-factor authentication, that you kind of grant that access without additional multi-factor authentications going forward. You give a token to that app. And so there is persistency also in cloud. You could start, the attacker in this case, could start to change email routing rules, other things, or could even send emails coming from the internal person. So they don't even have to tamper with email addresses anymore. It really, really comes from an internal IP or email address. And as such, it's more easy for people to click, or they will be more willing to click on links inside those emails. And then once it is impacting a system in the network, there will need to be some control. So you will have to, as an attacker, now establish backend control. So you'll have to set up command and control channels so that you can, from there, start watching around, I could say, right? So you'll have now to understand, where do I land on that system? What is there? So you'll have to start reconnaissance. You'll have to start looking around. What is possible? You'll have a goal with you. So you will start looking for maybe credentials in memory of that system that have more privileges than the one that you could establish the connection with. Now you will start looking for additional hosts that might have also more privileges in the network. So there's always a goal, there's a reason why attackers are doing this, and it will actually take time. And that means that where in the past we with security and prevention could not make any mistake, right now it's up to the attacker to not make any mistakes, because the more mistakes they make, and they will, because they have to look around, then there was going to be more options for us in the blue team for the protection, the detection capabilities, and to see what is going on. And that is why we are introducing what we call attack behavior, or look at behavior, not only at signatures. And that is exactly what I try to explain with this slide. So we know that there is SOCs, we know that there is security teams looking at events, and still there will be a lot of things being missed. Independent of the technology at the left-hand side that is being deployed, there is a lot of next generation features on the firewalls, on the anti-malware, anti-phishing, EDR type of things, but also web and other protection mechanisms. They might be protecting 99.999 maybe even of the inbound traffic, but there might always be a small hole that is open, and therefore there's going to be a need for detection capabilities as well. When you look at what we had until now, and for instance, my career started actually with the left bottom side, IDS. I've worked with Real Secure from ISS. That was very well perceived back in those days, but it had, if you now look back at it, one big flaw. It only could detect what was known. So you could have a pattern of packets on the network. You had a string for that, a signature, you could detect it, and then you could block that. But anything that was unknown was invisible. Anything that has happened in the past is not available anymore. Then there was the network forensics. That was kind of a rolling PCAP. So people were collecting much more data, could go back, but there was so much information that often, like we have a similar problem with the SIEM, you did not look at all, and therefore you were still missing things. And then there has been a shift also on the NetFlow thing that is actually been developed to monitor performance on a network, that now people are trying to also enhance that to look for security, which is not always working because the context that can be collected by NetFlow is quite limited. And as I said, the SIEM is very interesting, but it typically only has log events coming in. And as such, there's a lot of use cases, scenarios that you have to develop customly for your environment that could miss important items, or that you do not have the right information in there. So for that, you really need a tool that can collect raw data, that can actually enrich that data by collecting additional information, for instance, using Kerberos, using NetBIOS, using DNS, DHCP, so that you do not look at IP addresses, but that you look at hosts, and that you can talk about a host name rather than about an IP address, which will help you to find that back. Link that with Active Directory, so you have the context of that host in your network. You might even have additional information straight out of Active Directory talking about what OS is running on that, because that is all available through LDAP, or that you have integrations with EDR that can tell you also that information, but also can make responses already available at once. And so all of that with continuous input will be analyzed by AI, and we'll talk about that later on as well. But the AI will help us because there is a lot of robustness. The methods, the techniques, the tactics that an attacker can use are limited. They only can use what a regular user would use in the network, and as such, therefore, they also have limited capabilities to, you could say, explore the network. And that is where AI can help a lot. And that is where the need for machine learning, but also enriched with context, is going to emerge. So when I then continue, I would say there is a big need for lots of visibility. As I pointed out in the beginning, also cloud is in focus or in scope now. So we'll have to make sure we bridge the legacy network with cloud. We'll have to make sure that we look at a lot of things that also will enhance the staff that is working on those events to prevent alert fatigue, that we deliver clean, high fidelity information, that we are not looking at what is known, but that we will look at also what is known from a behavior perspective, right? So that is where we made a change in the game. And so our approach is quite, I would say, not unique, but quite specific. We have the OBSERV phase, you could say, so we need to collect data, but we are in this way not depending on a lot of the tools that you already have in your system. So the only thing we, for instance, require is that we can connect either on a tap or on a span port, and preferably see, for instance, the traffic from internal to the DC, from internal and the DC into the internet, and some of the lateral movement in between different segments of your network. We are not interested whatsoever to see the traffic coming from external to internal. Even the command and control traffic will actually be established from inside to outside, although of course the controller of the channel will be outside. So this is not to replace firewalls. This is not to replace email or other web protection capabilities. Of course, there's also ingestions of network traffic coming from cloud, or where there is no possibility to collect network traffic, we can also ingest log sources for events on authentication, on behavior within that, for instance, cloud environment. And then it is very important, as I pointed out earlier, to line the metadata importance, so to put additional context to that, so that there is, you could say, a tier one, it's a first level of inspection being done by, you could say, technology rather than by people, because that is an issue we see. We do not have always the right skill, we do not have the right amount of people that we can hire to do all of this. So if we have them, let's make them do the more advanced stuff, which is the validation of the real incidents. And that is really where the response will come to. So make sure we will have the right playbooks, that we can interact with Active Directory, with the EDRs, with your firewalls, with your switches, so that we can take an action rather than trying, for instance, to just use technology that has been 15 years and has never been working, where TCP reset or something like that is being used. That is not going to work. It's going to continue. It's going to retry. It's not working for non-TCP based approaches either. So there is where it is so important that NDR is integrating within your estate. So what are the critical threat detection capabilities that you require? The focus we have is twofold. First and above all, and that's why I introduced that slide with EDS, with the network forensics, for instance, is that there is a lot of research that is still ongoing, and security research is really, really fundamental, because that means for us also, we have, you could say, the white hats with us who are helping to understand what the behavior, what the thinking of an attacker would be. So how can he use the protocols that exist in a network? And this is where the famous saying of living of the land comes from. And the attacker needs to use what is available, and he needs to hide in plain sight. So that is where our security researchers will understand that, and where we can build machine learning technology that is supervised. And supervised means that we know, like with an IDS signature in the past, but not on packets, but now on behavior, what an attacker could be doing. And for instance, a lot of the things like command and control, like reconnaissance, actions, scans, etc., we can quickly catch. We do not have to learn a lot in the network, although there is, you could say, machine learning involved. It is quite instantaneously available. But at the other hand, there is also the data science component. There is a component where you need that mathematical power to understand what is exactly happening in a network, because whatever you want to build as a vendor, there's never a similar network that you will see. So we'll have to learn, what are the machines in your network, what are the protocols being used, what are the users there, how are they talking to each other. So there will be baselines being built, and then from there we can actually pull information in to understand that there might be some unusual traffic. But it is very important that you would not want to see all unusual traffic, because there will be a lot. and it will not help you in that alert fatigue. It will not help your analysts to find the needle in the haystack quickly. You really need to make sure you only flag what makes sense. And that is where the data science in combination with the security research will help us to really reduce the workload on the SOC and the security team big time. And this is what I meant with the combination of a couple of things. So the tactics, the techniques and the procedures that the attacker can use, as I said, is very limited. That also means that there is also typically a limited set of tools that will be used. And so for that, we can really apply the AI quite well. That's what we call the durable coverage. That means that we will be able for that to see both existing and well-known attacks, but also the novel attacks, because again, the technique that can be used is also only so limited. But what we also understand is that there is a lot of things that we could quickly detect, maybe even with the first packet. And for that we are, and I think most of that will even come in the July release, which is imminent by the end of this month, where we will be adding additional threat intelligence signatures so that we will help you to quickly identify common tools being used. And pardon me the swearing words, but the Cobalt strikes and the Empires, all of these Meterpreter type of things, we could recognize these, and then we can help them to augment the AI to, for instance, if we see there is a hidden HTTPS tunnel, which is typically something that the artificial intelligence can detect, which indicates command and control. If we then see that this might have been coming from Meterpreter or something like that, we will enhance that detection so that the analyst will see that much more quickly. Also, the IOCs on what potentially the vulnerabilities are currently, that you can do already today, import them with sticks into the system so that you have more. But there also we will be building and adding our own intel from the gate out into the system. So there's going to be quite a lot of enhancements in the future, not only to enhance the AI, that will be our prime focus, but also to complement that detection with additional information we can easily detect. And for that, as I said, a lot of the threat researchers we have focus on the attack complexity, you could say. And there is two types of threats typically. You have the opportunistic threats. You could say opportunistic in this way that it is to not get real data, but to get money, right? Or to destroy a network because you really are there to disrupt the business. These, of course, are quite quick and could replicate in the network easily in many situations, but still there is going to be not a 5-minute window. There will be weeks still typically between initial infections and a real botnet that or a ransomware that could be deployed, because you still need to figure out how can I deploy ransomware to the different systems in that network. What accounts can I use to do that? So there's still a lot of things that can be detected. But of course, when it is a persistent threat, there is multiple steps that needs to be taken. So the internal reconnaissance, the lateral movement, all of these are also things being mapped by MITRE attack framework. And that is also where we focus on a lot. So let's make sure that in the way that we look at this, we take the right information in. And where can you find that traffic? Typically in core switches and in some scenarios also on some access switches, because of course, you're not going to probably take in all the data from all of the access switches. It's something we designed together. But if you have a few, let's say, floors in your network where the execs are sitting, or there is really a lot of crown jewels, you might want to go down to the access switch there as well. But typically, if we can take a core switch that sees the traffic, as I said earlier, from internal to the data center, from internal and the data center out, typically also towards the core and the parameter, of course, as well as in some scenarios where you have a lot of VMware servers, for instance, we can also have the virtual sensors on. When it comes to, I would say, licensing, I don't want to spend too much time there, but we license on the number of concurrent IP addresses. So the number of sensors you deploy is, if it is a physical box, it's a one-time cost. If it is a virtual sensor within VMware, you deploy as many as you want. There is no additional cost related. So, but here you see also the dots, the colors. That is typically where we can see the traffic that interests us into building the different models. And so this is the only product slide I have built in, but we have a couple of components. So we can have detect running in Office 365, or the name changed to Microsoft 365. Then we have the Cognito Detect for Network, that is our sensors, as well as the virtual sensors that can be deployed. And then we have two additional tools, Recall and Stream. Recall is a cloud service where we have a data lake for you, where we collect all of the information surrounding detection. So you can really hunt, you can really do your forensics, you can look for IOCs. The same thing comes with Cognito Stream. The only difference there is that you would do it within your own data lake. So Cognito Recall is a service, Cognito Stream would be your own, Elk Stack would be your own Splunk or QRadar or whatever data lake you build. And that is all powered with a brain, a single brain that will get all of that information. Also, when you're running in Azure or AWS, all that information will come to the single brain so we can detect all of the potential issues at once. So what's the result of all this work? I think it's very important to look at use cases, right? When people are and organizations are building a CM, they really have either a few coming out of the box, and that depends on what SIM you use, or you'll have to build a lot yourself, and then you'll, depending of course on the events that you will get in. Typically that's log events, but when you look back at again the introduction, the majority of log events will come from detection of prevention tools, I must say. But these could miss things as well. For that, the NDR is a critical component. And then when we look at it, there is the threat investigation, the threat hunting, the compliance components that will be typically on your radar as well. And we built a lot of tools. We built a lot of predefined detections, of course, in the system. So we do that by collecting the information on the network, right? And we built metadata. And that metadata is super critical. It's based on the Bro-Zeek format, and there will be up to sometimes 600 different, not in every detection, of course, but we have hundreds of metadata fields available, and these will also be enriched. That's additional metadata available, and these could also be shared, for instance, with those data lakes, with those SIEMs. And so, for instance, to build, instead of detections on an IP address, we will try to find out either through integrations with vCenter, with Active Directory, with reverse DNS, with DHCP, with Kerberos traffic, what is the hosts behind that IP address. We will be able to group those systems automatically or manually into combinations. We will talk about privileges. PAA, it's what we call, it's privileged access analytics. This is really important because what an attacker is after is always a goal. He wants to find high privileges or elevated privileges. And so what we will do is we will try to build combinations of what that user is, what rights he really uses versus assigned attributes or permissions. So a privileged access management tool is important, but it is not telling the truth always. What we see is observed privileges. We see what that typical admin account or maybe elevated backup use or whatever from a strange system with a strange service is doing. Only that is really interesting for the analyst to look at. And that trio of analytics we bring to the surface. At the same time, there's a lot of security insight. So we will look into the beaconing. That's where also a lot of machine learning comes in play. But also, even though there is no need to decrypt all the traffic, we can still do a lot by looking into the hashes of the certificates, the JA3s, the JA3Ss. We look at domain rarities, etc. That will help us to find indications that there is something ongoing. And so when you look at this, don't get too much into the slide, but I want to just give you the different stages, typically phases, which we also map in the product, where you could say the progress. That's the behavior, but also the objective of the attacker. It's to progress into the network up to his goal, which is either to destroy or to find data. And so a lot of the left-hand side things, that is where our supervised models come to play. The right-hand sides, there is typically a lot of the unsupervised machine learning models that will be used. But this is, of course, not an extensive or a conclusive list. This is an example of detections of behaviors, models that we will have available within the product. And so if I apply this to something that has happened also in Belgium not so long ago, This is the Rio malware looking for ransomware infections. And what I have done is pointed out the different stages that campaign required, plus what are the different items we could have been looking at from the beginning to start finding that there was something wrong. So you see the blue things that are mapping to models, to detections that we had on our system. And of course, because a lot of those things, of course, are not immediately known, there is still a need for us as analysts to look at the data, but by cleaning and providing the right events, there is going to be a much higher opportunity for you to detect early in the game what is wrong and take actions to prevent the further damage. And I think I want to reiterate this again. So this is really on the detection. You kind of deploy this because you know that there will be holes, right? You know that there might be infections and that there might be progress, and this is really to detect and help you to react, you could say, to progress of attackers in your network. It's a very, very important component. And the way we try to do that is by trying to make it really, really simple. We take a risk-based approach, and a risk-based approach means that we're going to try to map detections to hosts and then or to accounts, and then we're going to plot these accounts or these hosts into a quadrant. And unlike with the magic quadrant from Gartner, in this case, you don't want to be in the upper right quadrant. So in this case, you really want to be staying low left or not even on. But this way you help an analyst to focus right from the gate on the right upper quadrant, and then you can make your way down to the left and then the bottom medium until left bottom. And there we will immediately show you the combination of detections that we have seen for a host. And I think that is where the power of this system lies, that you can really understand the different steps taken. You can look into the data and take conclusions from there. Now that we have reached this point, I think it is probably a good idea, before I come to conclusions, that I take you along in the interface, and I am quickly checking my clock. I'll probably have about 15 minutes for that. And then I can hopefully walk you around a little bit in what the analyst would see. So if I go here, Luc or Davy, if you could confirm that you can see my Safari browser.
Yeah, looking good.
Looking good. Thank you for that. So this is the interface for the Detect product. Remember how we have, you could say, 3 specific products, because the Office 365 Detect product, there has no additional interface. That is just a collector or a sensor, you could say, that is hosted in Azure, which will, with your permissions and granted permissions, connect into your Office 365 tenant, and it will look for, you could say, the management type of activity. It's not there to replace CASB. It is not there to replace your detection capabilities in E5. It is really there to bridge the movements, you could say, from what an attacker could do from in the Office 365 back into your network. And so it will deliver all of those events into the brain, and the brain is an appliance typically that will run in your network that can act at the same time also as a sensor. So in a majority of deployments, we will have one physical box that is the brain plus the sensor in your network, and then connects on taps or span ports in your network. So that is Detect. I will take a little bit of time also to show you Recall. That will be not too much, but a brief intro, because that is the data lake. That's a service that we host in the cloud. And it will look quite similar to what you would see with, for instance, Stream. The only difference is Stream would send information to your own data lake, and you might have to build your own reports. If this is built on Elk, Kibana, we can help you big time also by delivering reports and other tools to optimize your internal data lake. All right, going back here, if I start off with, for instance, changing this to the last 7 days, I have a starting point, and the dashboard, of course, is just giving me an indication, right? It immediately gives me some information about how many IPs am I monitoring, what are my key assets, because you can flag systems as important so that you can track them more quickly if there is something wrong with these. And then there is, of course, an overview of which are the worst offenders, which are the worst offender accounts, as well as what are the types of detections that we see. So this is an initial starting point. Typically, then you will want to start from a couple of points. It really means that this is a workflow that you will have to define, that your analyst will have to be comfortable with. But typically, you start either from hosts or campaigns or detections, right? Let me just go down on the ladder here, or on the interface view. And so when we look at the hosts, this is also the screenshot that you saw. We have this quadrant, right? And so in that quadrant, I can play around. I can look at what is there. But if I don't know maybe what might be here, and I am looking specifically for a specific system, I can also type the name of that system here and see whether or not it is there. And in this case, for instance, then it pops up. Another item is that there is also the option to really already start here with a lot of advanced searches. So I can, for instance, go and see indeed what are my active hosts, but I can also go down, for instance, to find out much more information. And I can just start typing host, and then you can see all of the different information sets that we keep in the table. And so this means, for instance, that I can even go down, and if I have this integrated with my LDAP, I can even find, for instance, display names or employee or a location, for instance. If I want to find out where hosts on a specific location might be impacted, I can use that advanced search. So the reason I point that out is because I typically will not come back here in hosts, but what I want to do right now is, for instance, click on one of those hosts. And then if there is a plus sign, it means there's multiple hosts with the same score. And you see here the threat score. That is how we build the axe, the vertical axe. That means how much we are sure that there is a threat, or what type of threat we have seen. And then the certainty, that's the horizontal axis, how sure are we of that threat. And the more, of course, you're climbing the ladder on both axes, the higher you come here. And that's where you need to look for. And then when you click on the system here, we get an immediate view on what that is. For instance, here I see the Piper desktop, and I can see what type of detections have been seen on that system, and I can take it from there. So we have other items, and this is the way we can look at it. So this, for instance, is something that takes my attention because I see some ransomware file activity. That is not so good, because that means that we have already seen encryption on files, but we can now look into a little bit of detail. By clicking on the host, I end up in this view. And what is important here is to maybe first look at the details. And in this case, there's not a lot of information. So the artifacts that I have learned are only coming in this case from DHCP. So still, I could connect and collect the information about the host, but there was not a lot more. I'll go back in a second, and I'll take another host, and we'll see potentially much more information. And then I can see the different steps that were taken. First and above all, I see at the left-hand side also the potential profile that we believe this was related to. And we also see the different steps that were seen on this host mapping and with the different attack phases. And then when we actually look a little bit into the details, we can see all of that information, and we can now look into more details by clicking through on this. So that's the first view that we have. If I go back and I go back to that Piper desktop that I had earlier on, I think it was this one, no, this one. So if I click on this one here, and now I check my details, here you see so much more information. This is the properly identified system, where I can also see who is the probable owner, because we have seen administrative or just service or connections to CIFs. That means the file shares. We could map then the user to that system. But we also, if there was, for instance, a VDI environment, we could see what are the different accounts that logged into that system. What were the services being used? And in this case, I can even find out if the password had been reset on that system just recently, for instance. This is all coming from Active Directory. In case I'm connecting with VMware, I also can get information about what cluster this was running in, what OS is on it. If it is coming, for instance, through also installations with EDR, in this case, there is both CrowdStrike and Defender. So I guess that normally this would only happen in a migration phase. But again, here I have links into both CrowdStrike in this case, as well as Microsoft Defender ATP, and I immediately actually can log into those systems directly from CrowdStrike, from Defender, from Carbon Black, and find, for instance, additional details collected by the EDR. It will bring me immediately to that host, and that host or that integration will deliver me also that information you see here. So the analyst will have so much more information to look at. And at the same time, we also have those integrations towards response. So rather than sending TCP resets, we can here do host lockdowns, or we can do account lockdowns if we are on the account page and lock down the account in Active Directory. And so here you see that there is quite a lot of information available. The other point is that you typically want to see whether or not that host is part of a campaign. If he's part of a campaign, there is another alert going off, because campaigns typically try to group systems that are related to each other or that seem to have a similar behavior. And that is where this will pop up. Let me take just one of them. Let me take this one maybe here. And what we start to see here is, first and above all, it's a visualization. We see that this system is where connections are going to. And then when I look at the arrows, I could probably imagine that either Piper or Deacon has been involved, because Deacon in this case is doing a lateral movement towards a domain controller in the AWS, in this case, infrastructure. And we see that there is remote suspicious execution. So typically this means that there is some lateral deployment of additional tools. And actually the arrow you can see is here. So most likely Piper Desktop is the one that started it off. Then there was the movement into Deacon and then into the DC, but all three have also been establishing a command and control tunnel back into this host. And then when we look at the events, we actually have our timeline. And in our timeline, I can find out that indeed this probably started on the Piper Desktop at this date, and then we can see the different steps taken to get there. So this is a very interesting point to start. If you have a campaign, that's where you can start looking around. Another mechanism is that you would say, right, I would like to do this mostly from the detections point of view. And this is, of course, a very valuable thing. So immediately in the screen here, you can see based on colors what is happening. And I really would say that what you want to see is a flat line for light blue. So botnets, that's definitely something you would see preferably flat lines for. If not, take an action, look into it. Similarly for command and control and reconnaissance and lateral, of course, all of these give you an indication what is going, and you have then here this list. And this you can start organizing. So you can start organizing for first scene, last scene. And for instance, if I take in this case, this one, just the top one, I can click through on it. And like with the host view, I now have additional information. So I can see again the host, but I also can see here based on the suspicious HTTP why we believe it is so. And we even give you an indication on what could happen actually in the different steps of setting up. And we give you also the information about what was the header construction that we believe was suspicious scene, and that was going to a torrenttv.net in this case. So here's a couple of things. First and above all, Morpheus was flagged as a key asset, so we want to really pay additional attention to this, I would say. That's one. And secondly, maybe from here we want to start taking some action. So what we could do is we can add tags. This will help us either in reporting or later on we can search for this so that we know, for instance, we saw this the first time on this date and we take an action to investigate, right? Or we can also add some notes that give us more context also to the others to help, or we can assign and share this information as well. If we figure out that this is quite okay and this was indeed normal traffic, which I believe it is not here, but imagine it is, then we can start triaging. We can start filtering, for instance, against the miscategorization and add this here. Or if this is much more custom, I can create a custom filter. I can say, right, this host or all hosts or hosts with a specific IP range and matching a specific condition domain is. And if we then click here, it will only pull the information either from the predefined or custom defined groups or what we saw in the detection. So we help you big time also in the triaging by not having to go back, remember, and what you have to type. We pull it in here in a drop-down box, and so this here will be available there. So a lot of cool things you can do here to investigate. To conclude on the detect view, I would like to move into the accounts tab. And the accounts tab is looking similar to what the hosts tab is looking for. So we also have the threat and the certainty view. The only difference here is now that we look at accounts rather than at hosts. And here you also see immediately if accounts were coming in through Office 365 or that they were coming in from the regular sensors. And by quickly expanding them all, we can see quickly what this was related to. So here we might see, for instance, also a malware stage upload in Office 365, privilege anomaly unusual trio. This, for instance, is something that interests me because privilege anomalies, that is really where you could make progression in a network. And this is exactly the objective of an attacker, trying to make its way by finding more permissions on systems that have more access and might be able to use more critical services. And so in this case, I can see, for instance, that the observed privileges are already rising. So this is already 5 out of 10. That is what we have seen this account use in the network, right? This is not what the privileged account management tools are telling me. This is really what we saw. And here, for instance, you see the integration with Active Directory. So if this is becoming too much for me, I could say disable this account. I could also automate this, both for Active Directory as well as with the EDRs. I could say that if the observed privilege is more than 5, if the threat score is more than 50, and the certainty is more than 50, so only in that specific combination, I would like to automatically disable an account. That is possible. So a lot of very valuable responses out of the box that are much more reliable than some other techniques. So when I then look here at the details, I can start to see something. I can now click through and it will now tell me trio information. And trio information means it will tell me about the host, the service, and the user. And what is interesting here is that this is telling me that this account running from this specific host, right, using terminal server services is very, very unusual. Normally, this is not seen. So normally what we see is that this service is being used by these accounts, right? And this is helping us big time to focus on what activity might be really suspicious, right? It's not because I see a new system or I see a new account that is connecting to a new service that this is unusual and therefore a threat. We know indeed that a threat typically is linked with an unusual set of traffic, but it's not because it is unusual traffic that there is also a threat. And this type of integration with privileged analytics, access analytics, that is going to help us much more quickly to find an option and to find out what might have gone wrong. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now, I'm going back to a detection, and I would like to briefly show you, maybe I'll do it differently. Let me go back to that thing here, and let me take DC, that server that we saw in the, I should have typed maybe more. I'm looking for it. It's one of those two. Typically, oh, here it is. I was going to say it's typically the last one that you want to find. So this one is a domain controller, which we also saw being participating in that campaign. You remember, that was the campaign we showed. What I now maybe want to see is additional information. So by clicking on investigate and detect, I make a jump into a different screen, but it's just one click away. And it will now give me additional information in the context of that host. So now I can see all of the different domains that system has been connecting to. What were the different internal connections? Did we see admin connections? That's a good news here. What were Kerberos, NTLM, RPC usages, DNS requests, HTTP, etc., etc. So we also find out what type of system this is, with what type of user agents, etc. This has happened. But maybe from here we want to do more investigation. So maybe we want to see what else is this host being connecting to. So I can click on using this host as a filter. I can now pin it so that it is not disappearing. And then I can jump into the discover section. And in the discover section, I might want to go into maybe SMB. I want to know what has happened on the front of SMB. And now I can start adding things like, okay, give me the path, give me the version of SMB that was being used, which is good. It's already V2. Also I can look at what were the original systems asking for all of that data, and I can find out what file shares, etc., were in play. So this will help us to understand the context of maybe a detection and what was around. A lot of this information is being pulled if you have the combination of detect and recall also into detect. What are other options is that I can do the threat hunting from here. So let me actually remove this filter here and open up our predefined searches. And what you can now do, for instance, is I can search for, let's say, certificates that might be expiring in the next 30 days. This is important because a lot of organizations have been impacted in the past, that certificates expired, services were disrupted, a lot of cost to renew them, but also potentially a lot of revenue issues. Other things, if we have indications for eternal blue, we can look for those type of payloads. If we have indications for meta-preter information, we can look for that. So there's a lot of things that we can do to search, what we help you with out of the gate. And the same thing we have with some of the dashboards. So for instance, I can pull up a security assessment dashboard that will help us to understand, especially in the COVID-19 days, how many RDP servers did we maybe pull out our sleeves? How many of those have remote access? Or maybe about our SMB service. What are our SMB services? So it's quite okay in this environment, not too many, but also what are the unique public IPs scanning SMB? What are the version ones? Oh, 13 of those. I don't want that, right? These are the ones that were vulnerable to an eternal blue, for instance. If we see servers that use the protocol on the BIOS and the motherboards, the network interfaces that could pull information even before the operating system is running, net BIOS traffic, maybe weak ciphers that we see in the network, and so on and so on. So a lot of tools here that can help us to immediately pinpoint some items. Maybe there's even also had the dashboard on maybe techniques and procedures, right, for DNS, for HTTP in this case, and many others. So in this view and in this database, there's not a lot of information, but that's what it is all about. So I hope with this brief demo on the interface, we have given you an understanding of what is possible. And with this, I think we could come to some conclusions, right? And with those conclusions, I would like to pave the way for a couple of questions, which hopefully came in. What we try to do is help your organizations, for instance, also to map with what CISOs, what security departments want to do, which is, for instance, in this case, an example with Gartner Carta and the continuous adaptive risk and trust assessments model. We can help you big time. We can help you in the predict phase, what I showed you in the demo with the threat hunting, the compliance validations. This can help you to design a good security infrastructure. Even the prevention will be fueled by all of that research you could do to harden your systems. Of course, you will have your preventive capabilities there, your next generation firewalls, your EDRs, but even those we are compatible with, we can fuel them with information, and vice versa. We can get information from these and to optimize the further detections, where we can really look at the behavior and focus on delivering high fidelity with lots of metadata that you can use later on to do your research, to potentially come back, you could say, in a symphony with prevent, where you can actually feed those prevention capabilities with additional information, so they get more intelligent and more effective in also protecting against the newly discovered threat vectors within your network. So this is an example with Carta. There's a lot of options also to be part of Zero Trust and others by using this type of architecture. Then to conclude, I think it's also important to point out that we, of course, work quite well with this SOC visibility triad, and this is also something that Gartner has been putting forward. But there is a need, and actually the primary component is NDR, because that is the one that can see without the requirement for logs, etc., what is really happening on the network, can enrich the endpoint, and then both of these can enrich the SIEM so that you really have much more actionable, much more valuable information available there from where your security teams can work with. And then typically also integrations with the source and the Splunk Phantoms, the Mistos of this world, where you can orchestrate a lot of the responses. So many can be done directly out of the NDR. If you choose to go with a SOAR, also there, of course, we can deliver lots of information. And then finally, I would like to show this slide, because I think the ecosystem is important, right? We don't want to be a black box. A black box is never a good thing in a network. It needs to be, of course, able to add value by helping you to be more safe, to close the gap to breaches, to give you additional context, to ease the job of the security researcher. But that only can be done if that also fits in within your existing environment, and that it can play well with all of this, both on the investigation, or actually 4 times, right, on the investigation, the response, the different type of infrastructures you have, as well as on the enforcement level. If there is a native integration, the better, but we also have a lot of API capabilities to, for instance, integrate with even things that are not here on the screen. I can think about the Aruba ClearPasses of this world, where we can feed all of that threat and certainty information so that also their logic can be applied and well considered decisions can be taken to isolate hosts on the network, yes or no. With this, I believe that I've reached the final slide. That is where we point out again that the goal is to really reduce the number of events that you have to research, and as such reduce the workload and the pressure on your team, on your security analysts, to focus on what matters. With this, I'd like to thank you, and we'll check in with Luc whether there is any questions that we can take a look at.
Hey, Stan, yeah, thank you very much. I think you were very clear. There's one question that actually came up, and it was a little bit more about the Office 365 integration. What exactly are you guys looking at? What kind of data are you looking at in Office 365?
Right. So as I pointed out in the conversation, I don't think what we want to do is look for what the traditional CASB is doing, right? We are not interested in itself to what files are there, what content is there. That's the job of DLP. That's the job of AIP, Azure Information Protection, etc. What we are there is to understand whether there is administrative or management type of tasks that are happening either by the administrators in Office 365 or even users that can, for instance, change within their Outlook client. They can change rules on forwarding, etc., etc. So these are the type of events that we try to pull in and then take it from there. So maybe if I try to go back quickly to my demo interface, I can go back to the accounts. And what I can do here is go and search for Office 365. No, I need to put the colon in the back. So what we now see is all of the different accounts that came in through the Office 365 integration. And then when I open it up, what you see here is that, for instance, we are trying to look for suspicious mail forwarding, what I found out or discussed before, but also the brute forces, the disabling attempts. And the good news is that, let me, for instance, go into this one here. If we have a detection, we give you all of that here, right? This is the user. And for instance, we want to know a little bit more about the mail forwarding. We give you some additional context here. And in every detection, you have also that little question mark on the top. So we give you some indications on why, for instance, this might be suspicious, what triggers this, what are the possible root causes, what could have been the impact, and what you probably would try to do to validate this. And also, even with Office 365, we try to map this with the tactic or technique as described in the MITRE attack framework. So these are you could say the items we look for. It's really on security things, brute force, etc. Make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's it for the questions. I would like to thank you for the pretty nice presentation and good demo, and everybody else that joined today for the session. If you need any more information, feel free to reach out to either Davey, to myself, or to Stijn, and we'll be happy to do a one-on-one session and see what your requirements are. So with that, thank you everybody, and have a good one.